out to the family in the food truck. I was at dinner. I don't know. We were at dinner. Oh, right.
Ladies and gentlemen, as we begin our services here this morning, we would kindly ask if everyone would please turn off or silence all electronic devices. Thank you.
So thank you, first of all, everybody, for being here this morning. I want to take you back to 1951. It was the fall of 1951, and picture we're at City College in New York City, and there was a guy whose name was Rabbi Zuckerman. And Rabbi Zuckerman was the director of the Hillel Foundation, which is the largest Jewish campus organization in the world. And this guy, Rabbi Zuckerman, he formed a discussion group back in 1951, that fall, called Introduction to Judaism. And among other people, he invited 2 students to participate in that discussion group. One of them was this tall, skinny guy, probably pretty cocky. It was Stanley Friedman. And the other one was pretty hot-looking young woman who was really sharp and really smart, and her name was Phyllis Alpern. And were it not for that chance meeting back in 1951, none of us would be in this room at this time. You know, sometimes my kids have said, and I think the same, I would have had different parents if they hadn't gotten together. Anyway, my father graduated from CCNY, which is City College of New York, in 1953, and he spent the next 2 years in the Army. He had been in the ROTC program, so he came out as an officer, was in the Army, was in Germany. My mother graduated the following year, 1954, and immediately began a career as a teacher. My parents got married. My father came back from Germany in April of 1955, and my parents got married the next month. So May of 1955, they got married. My parents were married for 65 years. That's a long time. And their lives took them from New York City they ended up moving to Denver for a little while, then Minneapolis, where Larry was born in Denver, and then Paul, Carl, and I were all born in Minneapolis. And then they moved back to New York briefly, and then to New Jersey, where they spent most of their lives. They had the 5 children. My sister Jen was born in New Jersey. And after they both retired, my father for the second time, but we'll get to that story later. But after they retired for a second time, they moved to Arizona to be closer to where Jen lives, and to be in a lot warmer weather. Eventually, they decided 3 years ago that they wanted to move back to New Jersey to be closer to the rest of the family. They came back to Morristown, and they moved to the Evergreens, where so many of our good friends here are from, and they met lots of people at the Evergreens. When my parents moved back, my mother, as some at the Evergreens know, my mother was really struggling with, she had some form of dementia and was really starting to lose a lot of her capabilities, and she was struggling pretty badly. And she ultimately passed away in June of 2020, which, as we all remember, was right at the early part of the pandemic. And so in those early days of the pandemic, we couldn't even visit. And so when my mother passed away, it was really a hard time because we couldn't even go visit her at all. We ended up actually just doing my father's idea, we did a Zoom funeral. And so we all got together and just shared stories. My mother's last months were, as I said, they were very difficult as her condition was deteriorating. She really couldn't remember much. She had trouble even eating. She had trouble doing most things. And the way that my father took care of her during those years was really something to say. My father was so loving and so caring for her. One of the people from the Evergreens, as they came through line, commented on the fact that he was so kind to her as he helped her to figure out what to eat or to use this utensil instead of that utensil. It was really a hard time, but my father was amazing with her. He was really devoted to her. He insisted on taking care of her in their apartment for as long as he possibly could, until really the very, very end, the last couple of weeks. Over the last 2 years since my mother had passed away, my father had to learn to take care of himself. And my parents had the very typical relationship, I would say, of people of that generation, where my mother did all the household things. My father didn't know how to do anything. I mean, nothing. And so he didn't know how to make toast, I don't think. He didn't know how to boil water, nothing. And so he had to learn. And my father, because my father was always a learner, he just had a hunger for education. That's why I went to law school, why I did everything that he did. So he was always a learner, and so he always had this attitude that, okay, so I don't know how to do something, I can learn. He was never a victim about, oh, I don't know how to do anything. It was, I can learn that. So he would call Catherine, he would call Barb, and they would teach him how to do things. And so he learned. If he didn't know how to do some things, he would look them up on YouTube. My father was always big on the computer, and he would download and print things from YouTube. He had a loose leaf of all the things he downloaded and printed from YouTube. But he would figure out how to do things. That's how he was. So that never really stopped him from learning anything. Though he missed my mother terribly, and my father was just never one to wallow in pity. And so instead, he threw himself into the evergreens and got involved in as many things as he could. My father, this was typical of my father too, that when my parents first moved back to the Evergreens, sometimes when you move into someplace new, it's hard to get to know people. And so my father printed business cards that said, let's meet, with his phone number on it, and he would give them to people so that they would know the phone number so that they could connect with him so he could meet people. And he became an ambassador at Evergreens to welcome new people that came to the Evergreens. That's just how he was. He wasn't going to sit back and be a victim about that. He was going to figure out, all right, so how do I meet people? Now, in July, my father turned 90, and he was beginning to slow down physically, but he was intellectually really sharp at 90. I mean, he was interested in people, he was interested in learning, he was very active, again, mentally, but he was starting to slow down. And unfortunately, somehow, after his 90th birthday, just in July, his physical condition deteriorated pretty rapidly. And in the last week, so my father passed away last Friday night, the 4th. That last week was really a tough week, and he was really losing the ability to communicate. There wasn't much that he could really do. It was hard to even understand. He'd start a sentence, and then it would just kind of drift away. It was hard for him to even express what he wanted to express. But Tuesday morning a week ago, I got over to the Evergreens in the morning to see him, and he was more alert than he had been the day before. I mean, Monday was a really bad day, but Tuesday he was a lot more alert. And I said, Dad, you look a lot better today. And he said, yeah, I feel better. And so he kind of rallied a bit, and he said something in this sort of brief moment of clarity that I thought was pretty compelling. And he said the same thing to my brother Paul later that afternoon. And here's what he said. He said, it would be really wonderful if I could be reunited with your mother. So my parents weren't overly religious. And so, there's a lot of people here, and you all have different points of view about what happens after we die and whether we're united with people or not. So that wasn't a typical thing for my father to say. But my father really wanted to be with my mother again. He really missed her terribly. So when my siblings and I talked about today's service, and we talked about, so what would my parents want? And they were pretty low key. In fact, I didn't even realize this, but before my mother had passed away, my father came here to Platt Memorial Chapel and made arrangements for when he would pass away. I didn't even know this. Karen and I were here Saturday, and Harry Platt pulls out, well, here's your father's account. I didn't know about this. And what he had decided was that he wanted to be cremated and he didn't want service. That was my father. He just was pretty low key, didn't want a lot of attention to him, but tough luck. He didn't service anyway. And given how they were, as we talked about what we should do, it was my sister Jennifer who had the idea. She said, we should honor both our parents. Since my mother didn't really have a chance to be honored, and my parents were always together for 65 years. And so today, we really want to celebrate both of my parents, not just my father, because they were a pretty remarkable couple, as you'll hear from some of our people. So I'm going to ask my sister Jennifer to come up and share some thoughts about my parents.
Thank you all for being here. As my brother Dave said, my name is Jennifer, and I am Stan and Phyllis's daughter. I am also their favorite daughter, and I usually tell my brothers, all four of them, Larry, Paul, Carl, and Dave, that I am their favorite sister. I also share the cherished role as the favorite aunt. As Dave said, when my dad passed away, we were thinking about what should we do and how should we handle it, and having no idea that my dad had already made some plan, we thought it would seem odd not to do something for them both. As Dave said, we lost Mom during COVID, and our Zoom call was honestly rather lame, but my dad wanted to do it electronically because he was really into computers. And I also knew that if you did ask Dad, if we had the opportunity to ask him what to do, he would say, nothing for me, but you should do something for your mother. That was exactly what he would say. And for me, it's very hard for me to think of my dad without thinking about my mom, or think of my mom without thinking about my dad. They, in my mind, were always a team. In fact, I always saw them working together, and a vision I have of them always is holding hands. And when I think about them, team is kind of a resounding word that comes to mind. When I think back as a child, and later as knowing them as an adult, it's hard for me to ever remember them saying a mean word to each other. It just kind of didn't come out of their mouths. If they fought, I never saw it. They must have, but they never let me see it. They never played one against the other. There was never a go ask your father or go ask your mother, or if you did, that was really a bad thing, because whatever they did, it was together. So if you asked one, the other stood by them. And that togetherness and that teamwork is something that they definitely passed down to us as their 5 children. I never remember a conversation where they sat down and talked about us acting as a team, but they must have modeled it so well that I think the grandchildren would probably agree that there's a Friedman team. So much that there was a time when we had Friedman team t-shirts, believe it or not. There are a lot of memories of us working together as a team, usually my dad in the lead, sometimes with a clipboard, us raking leaves as a team, shoveling snow as a team, painting fences as a team, but there was the 5 of us working together. And again, I have absolutely no recollection of them telling us that we had to work together, but there must have been some incredible modeling. My brother Larry, as the oldest, definitely took up the mantle, and he became team leader. When my parents weren't around, Larry was in charge. He organized us. He organized us into football games where I had to go long really far and the rest of the game was going on over here. But that is the way it was. There were soccer games, there were baseball games. I remember Larry organizing all of the cousins down to the field in Madison High playing baseball. And he led us in creating gifts for my parents. One time we had a poster that was the size of their entire bedroom wall as an anniversary gift that he led us into. He led us into opening a bank account when we were kids to put money into for an entire year so that my parents could take an actual vacation without us. And as I said, we even had Friedman team t-shirts. Now sadly, we lost my brother Larry 4 years ago. And then my mom, and then my dad. And there has been a shift in the team. My brothers have had children, 10 of them, and those children are now married, and now there's 10 great-grandchildren, and I am pleased to see all of the new teams being built. And in our 50s, just me, and the 60s, all of those older people, are redefining the original Friedman team. And over the past few months, as the new team has had to make decisions with regard particularly for my dad and his health care, I think we did what my parents did. We were facing difficult decisions and we talked. There was many a family meeting by phone. We listened to each other. We respected each other. We made decisions together. If someone was uncomfortable with the decision, we got together again and we talked again until we were all on the same team. And the words I heard over and over were, "I trust you." Those words kept coming out of our mouths. And I think that's a great tribute to my parents and what they taught us. I've had so many people tell me about families that fell apart when making decisions about an aging parent or a parent who's passed away. And I'm so proud that that's not us, because I think that's a tribute to my parents. We are Stan and Phyllis's children, and it's hard to imagine that we wouldn't do what's best for the team. Now, as Dave mentioned, my parents were married for 65 years. And over the past week, I had the privilege and the pleasure, with the help of my sister-in-laws Barb and Catherine, and the help of my brother Paul, who acted as Sherpa, and made me laugh a lot, to clean out my parents' last place that they lived together. And it took quite a while because I kept getting sucked into all the memories and the pictures and all the things that there was there. And it really gave me a look into my parents' lives together, things I didn't know about them, the keepsakes. And one of the things that I found was a card that my mom wrote to my dad on May 26, 1975. I was 11 years old then, and that was their 20th anniversary. And if I can make it through it, I'd like to share with you what my mom wrote. Dear Stan, couldn't find the right card, so I decided on a little note instead. I don't always tell you how much I love you and how much I appreciate you. I really think you're terrific, dear. To all our ups and downs, I can honestly say there's never been a moment when I wasn't glad that I married you. Happy anniversary, dear. Looking forward to the next 20 years. All my love, Phil. Now, my parents spent not just another 20 years, but another 45 together. When my dad turned 90 this past summer, he and I had a long conversation on the phone. He was delighted to have spent his 90th birthday with his children, with my brothers, and he mentioned particularly he got to see Hannah, who was pregnant and doing so well. She was wearing bright colors, he told me. And he also told me that the only thing that made him sad was that my mother wasn't there to spend it with him. And I told him something. I said, but she is here. She's here all the time. And he asked me what I meant, and I said, she's in the earrings I'm wearing, because these were hers. She's in the thoughts that I have each day. She's in the thoughts I have about exercise and staying fit in your older years. As I think about my mom walking up 3 flights of stairs at the age of 80 to get to her apartment. She wasn't taking the elevator. She's in the things I say when a friend gets something new, and I say, use it in good health. That's what my mother would say. And he said, boy, that's true. And you know what? My dad is still here too. I will think of him on Sunday mornings when I drive to my office and I call him. And he always says, how's business? Because that's what he always wants to know. And I'll still have that conversation in my head with him. I will think of him when I look at my desk and I see piles of paper, because we Friedmans come from a long line of pilers. I'll think of him when my brother Dave calls a computer a fine piece of machinery. And I'll also mostly think of him when I look at my brothers and so many of my nephews, who have my dad's face, his smile, and unfortunately many of them his ears. And I think of my parents now together again, and I'm sure without a doubt that they are happy to be together for not just 65 years, but forever. And I know that they are holding hands.
Micah, will you come up and do a little reading for us? Micah's grandson number, I don't know what, a lot.
Good morning. As David said, I'm Micah, one of the grandchildren, and I'm just going to share something, a memory of Phyllis, or related to Phyllis. So if when you came in today, you looked at the photos on the table in the back, there was one of Phyllis and 3 children sitting with buckets on the back of like a tractor, and that was myself, Ben, and Hannah, and we were going blueberry picking, and it was something that Phyllis brought the family to do for many years, and it was a lot of fun as a kid, and the poem's kind of about that. A big thing for me too was when we left, we got ice cream on the way home, and then Phyllis made blueberry muffins. In order to plunder the blueberries of the fields of southern New Jersey, it was necessary to lumber out to the sunburned fields of somewhere in a tractor-pulled wagon trailer. It was a family operation and major. Here we harvested blueberries by the acre, picking as much as we could save for later. We were day laborers, antioxidant crusaders, working only for pay in the form of ice cream favors, chocolate and vanilla flavors. In fact, it's beyond my memory where we worked, the place of duty unimportant. Instead, I recall a dairy stand invariably to be where we'd land when traveling home. The task of gathering berries only necessary to ensure the purpose of acquiring ice cream primarily. Pennies per pound, it was shopping on a budget. A few dollars funded enough fruit for a month or 100, as long as all hands picked berries as instructed. Not all the berries we plucked made it into our rustic buckets. Many went straight to the stomach, disrupting appetites for lunches. And some, if mushy or looking disgusting, were thrown at cousins, strangers ducking to avoid blueberry crossfire interrupting their discussions. Berries surviving immediate consumption were used in fruit salad production, or stuffed in batter meant for the oven, making muffins. Survivors were shut in the freezer by the dozens to be summoned later for pancakes or something.
How old were you when you wrote that, Mike?
That was several years ago.
Only several words, but it was a lot of that.
Elena, would you share some of your thoughts? Staying with grandchild theme here.
Hi, I'm Elena, and my sister Jessica is sitting right there, and we are the daughters of Carl and Yvonne. I wrote something, but I wanted to piggyback off of what Uncle David said about the cards, and my mom recently passed away, and we had a bunch of people at the house, and Grandpa was there, and my cousin on my mother's side, Edward. And when we found out Grandpa passed away, my mom's brother and his wife reached out, and us three didn't think into it. We were like, how do they know? But we were like, just going about the day. And I was on the phone with my uncle, and he said, Edward told us. And I said, oh, how did Edward know? And he said, after my mom's funeral, Grandpa and my cousin were talking, and for an extended time, and Grandpa gave him one of those cards, and he said, this is a friendship card. Let's keep in touch, write me a letter. So my cousin Edward did just that. He wrote a letter, and I believe the mail was going to Aunt Catherine and Uncle David's house, and then, so I just wanted to share that little note because I think it's really shows who Grandpa was through it all. And I liked that he was combining both sides of my family and was showing interest. So this is what I actually wrote. My grandparents' impact on me began at a young age. When all of the grandchildren were young, Grandma and Grandpa would send out in the mail homemade movie tickets for admission to attend movie night at their house. It was special because there was a decent amount of us, and it made me feel very, very connected to my family. The movies were always classics, and for some reason there was one particular movie that stood out to me. It was called Sitting Pretty. Years later, I told Grandpa that movie stayed with me for some reason, and about a week later, a copy of Sitting Pretty arrived in the mail for me with a note. It felt like a piece of love that was just for me from him. There are infamous tapes that Grandpa recorded in the 90s that when we're all together we do talk about, and I refer to these as the interviews. He went to every grandchild, whether they were at another cousin's home or their own, and asked a series of questions and discussion topics, and what came from that was pure gold. During Grandma and Grandpa's 50th anniversary in Calgary, Canada, we were all together, and it was so special. We all watched the whole thing of the interviews, laughing, reflecting, and filling the room with love. That was their legacy. These are two traditions that I plan to carry with my children and my grandchildren. Thank you, Grandma and Grandpa, for the beautiful foundation that you gave us all. I love you.
I'm going to ask my daughter Hannah, otherwise known as Sister Bear, to share with us some thoughts. Hannah's a teacher, as my mother was.
So like my dad said, I'm Hannah, I'm the youngest grandchild, and I'm also a teacher, and I think my love of teaching kind of stemmed from my grandma. She was a phenomenal teacher, and she was the kind of teacher that parents would call the school and ask the principal to be in her class. And over the years, she kept a lot of letters from her kids and from the parents showing their appreciation for what she did for their families, and so I picked a few of them to read to show what an impact she made on the lives of the students that she taught. Phyllis, words seem inadequate to tell you what you have meant to my boys and myself. I hope in their years ahead they have another teacher who puts so much of herself into the classroom and therefore into their lives. You have always been so generous with yourself and your time. You have a wonderful blend of kindness, patience, and authority, which just attracts kids to you. Your classroom has been learning with fun. Another one mentions, I just want to take the time to let you know how much I have enjoyed your class. It's very clear to me how you generate interest, excitement, and the willingness to learn in your students. You seem to know exactly how to ask the right questions, to draw more information from your students, which is a really hard thing to do, by the way. And then you manage to guide them into thinking even a tad more. I could see the wheels turning in their heads and was pleased to hear their positive responses to your gentle guidings. At the same time, you managed to make them feel like they had done it on their own. How good they were all feeling. This was a feeling of accomplishment and self-worth flowing in your classroom. Even if the children did not fully comprehend what they were feeling, they had to know that it was a good feeling. Another letter mentions, I think we all had one teacher who stands out above the rest. One who cared more, taught with incredible enthusiasm, and passed enthusiasm and thirst for learning onto her students. She goes on to say how she hopes her boys think of Phyllis, Mrs. Friedman, my grandma, as that one teacher. There's no doubt in my mind that you will be my kids' memory of the best in early education. When I have said, look up teacher in the dictionary, and there you will find Mrs. Friedman's picture. I firmly believe it. You are the epitome of excellence in teaching. And from that same letter, I want to wrap it up by incorporating Grandpa as well. She even mentions, please let Mr. Friedman know how impressed I've always been with his involvement and concern with your students as well.
I remember the first parents' meeting. You held when my daughter was in your class. It was incredible to me that the husband of a teacher would take the time to meet the parents of his wife's students. Justin, I don't expect that of you. Then he came to back to school night and the sleepover, the infamous sleepover. What a guy. I understood then what made the entire Friedman experience so special. You didn't leave your students at 3 p.m., which is also really hard to do. They were in your heart always, and there you will remain for us, in our hearts. So Grandma and Grandpa, you'll be in our hearts.
I'm going to ask my wife, Catherine, to share some of her thoughts.
I know Stan would love to see you all here. Thank you for coming and supporting him, and by extension, you're supporting all of us, and we need it right now, so thank you. You could have been anywhere else today, but you chose to come here and honor our parents. While I know we're honoring both Phyllis and Stan this morning, my remarks will center on thoughts I've always had about Stan, but which have recently crystallized in my mind. All of these are my own thoughts, and some people may experience this concept a little differently, and it can certainly be debated. But here's one idea that has kept coming back to me as I've recently had the privilege, the sacred privilege, to have been deeply in Stan's close world. In this time where people and beliefs can seem to lean toward an either-or way of thinking, one where a situation requires a choice between two different sides, and both those sides together are not possible, I believe Stan is an exception to that concept. Stan, to me, is not an either-or man, but a both-and man. And I find that inspiring and refreshing. For example, while Stan may have seemed to be on the shy side, never choosing to be loud or gregarious or attention-seeking, he was also quite intentional in going out of his way to meet people, get to truly know them. He knew the importance of friendships and connections, and he wanted others to feel welcome, especially at the Evergreens. He was an ambassador extraordinaire. So, both shy and outgoing, both and. While Stan was a serious person who took his responsibilities of work and fatherhood earnestly, he could also experience a good laugh so hard that he dripped tears and snot. It was difficult to tell sometimes if he was crying or laughing, but when his hand reached into his pocket for his freshly ironed white handkerchief, we knew he was having a good belly laugh. Both serious and mirthful, both and. Stan was certain about many things, such as vegetables are yucky, but never so certain in his own thoughts that he wasn't open to learning an opposite or differing perspective. Both certain and open, both and. I thought of Stan as a traditional man, no blue jeans or wrinkled shirts for him. In fact, he had a wardrobe akin to the late television icon Mr. Rogers. If you know, you know. Stan appreciated his past and the life he had, surrounded by aunts and uncles and cousins, though I never heard him dwell on the way things used to be, or say he wished for the good old days. But along with his deep appreciation for traditions and his life history, Stan, to me, was also forward-thinking. He was willing, no, eager, to embrace new ideas and new technologies. He was willing to trade paper and pen for this newfangled thing called a Macintosh. Remember those? And though the learning curve was steep, he relished its challenge. As every new technology emerged, Stan wanted to learn it, both traditional and forward-thinking, both and. It took dedication and a deep, deep commitment to his work, but Stan achieved much-deserved financial and career success. At the pinnacle of his insurance career, he parlayed that hard-earned success into putting himself through law school to emerge not to be the next Perry Mason, but a champion of the underdog, the wayward youth, the parents who were hard on their luck, the tenants facing eviction who needed someone to represent them. So, both a success and a humble champion of the underdog, both and. Always prudent with his finances, Stan was also generous to the nth degree. More than a few times, an anonymous Amazon package would show up a couple days after he and I had discussed a book or a product. Elena mentioned this. So both prudent and wildly generous. Stan was immersed in his family's past, and we've got genealogy charts and stories that show the results of his curiosity for the love of generations past. He genuinely relished researching and connecting with people above him on the vast family tree. But while he was super interested in his past, he was dearly excited about the generations that came after him, through him, deeply invested in each of his children and their spouses, each grandchild and their mates, and each new great-grandchild. So, a man who both honored the family that came before him and delighted in the future generations as well. Stan, a wonderfully flexible, both and gentleman, so refreshing, so admirable, so much missed. And Stan, as many of you know, was a keeper of correspondence. You would dash off an email and forget about it, but Stan would always print it and file it in the right file. And my sister-in-law found this week when she was going through files. It was an email I wrote to Stan on May 10th, 2020. My mother-in-law passed in June of 2020. So I wrote this I addressed it to Stan for him to read to Phyllis for Mother's Day. And it says, "Stan, can you read this to Phyllis for me?" So this is what I wanted him to say to Phyllis for me because we couldn't see her in person. "I'm thinking about you a lot this Mother's Day, Phyllis. I'm honored to have you as my other mother, and I'm grateful for the way you've been a mother to David. I have benefited from your remarkable work as a mother, as David has been the most supportive husband and fellow parent I could hope for. It must have been exhausting to raise 5 children, all so close in age, and I admire how you did it. Most of those years, you were working a full-time job. Your examples of hard work, structure, love, and fairness have always stood out to me. I know it must be really hard, Phyllis, to not be able to express what you want to say, but it's clear to me that you're able to hear what we say to you. So listen and trust when I say how much I love and respect you, whether or not you can respond. You're always dear to me as David's mother, as my mother-in-law, and as a special grandma to Ben and Hannah. Happy Mother's Day, Phyllis, with love and gratitude." So I know that Stan read that to her, but I just wanted to say it again to her. And again, thank you for being here. It's so touching to us, Stan and Phyllis's survivors, that you loved him as much as we did. Thank you.
Ask Jake to share with us a reading.
I'm Jake, another grandkid, and to honor Phyllis, I'm reading a poem written to her by her son, my father Larry. It's dated Hanukkah 1979, so he would have been 22, and she would have been, 46, if I have that right? Somewhere around there. It says, I have a song to sing, I have a song. I've repressed it for oh so long. A song of you, Mom, about you, Mom. Ma, Mom, Mother, words only though, spoken symbols. Yet you are real, alive and full. It has taken me so many years, why so many years? Held back my tears by hidden fear, but now I need to tell you, I so need to tell you. I love you, Mom. I hug you, and your warmth and security I receive. Please know I love you expressly, though embarrassment I feel, and rue that it has taken me so long, oh, so long, to give you my song. Oh, Ma. Thank you.
Paul? Son number 2. Well, thank you all for coming. And I've had to edit my comments on the go because everyone's stealing my thoughts. But I'm grateful for that. I'm going to share thoughts of mine of my parents separately so you get a sense of who they were and how they impacted us. So as David had mentioned, my mother grew up actually in a neighborhood that my father found himself in as his family moved around a little bit in Inwood, which is in the northern part of Manhattan. She was an excellent student, actually enrolled in, or got admitted to, after applying to Bronx High School of Science, which is a specialized school, graduated there after 3 years, and actually went on to City College, which was free for New Yorkers. The price was right, where she met my father. She mentioned that at that time, there were only really 3 options for women: secretary, nurse, or teacher, so she picked teacher. That's what she studied. Her experience, which I have to admire, I'll just say admire, after being involved in my own grandkids' lives at this stage, where it takes, some people say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes 2 parents, 2 grandparents, and a babysitter to raise these 2 little kids. My mother raised all of us, the 5 children and occasional dogs, with really no help. My father was out working, and Mom really did everything. But it was very typical of that era in the 60s. But to think that she could get us up in the morning, I chase after grandkids, try to get their clothes on, try to corral them. Then she got 5 kids awake, dressed, had their breakfast, and off to school is remarkable. Then, obviously, before she went back to teaching, she had to do all the house chores, get it all done for the kids to return home, dump all their stuff on the dining room table, and run off to play, change out of their school clothes, and it was a remarkable task. It took until my mother decided to go back to work. Now, I don't know that it was a decision that was made because she wanted to get away from the kids a little bit, or they needed the money, whatever it was, or pursue her career that she had to take a break from, but she decided to go back to teaching. And I remember my father sitting us down. He was in the kitchen in 19 Glen Avenue in Old Bridge, and saying, okay, Mom is going back to her teaching. There's no way she can do all the work that we've been doing around the house, she's been doing, while you're out there playing. And so we were all of, elementary school, maybe starting junior high, middle school age. And your mother is going to do the cooking, the wash, and that's it. And shopping for the food. But everyone else is going to do the work. And so what we're going to do for the vacuuming,
doing the dishes, pots and pans, bathrooms, whatever, mowing the lawn, whatever else needs to be done, you children are going to do that. Now, Jen doesn't remember this. She was too young, but at least us boys had to do all the work. And it was a list put on the refrigerator. I've seen some of those lists at Larry Barber's house. So on the refrigerator every week were your assignments. And we probably earned a quarter in allowance through the process. But that was a change. And so my mother now was free to go back to teach from some of her responsibilities. That didn't mean she worked any less, because teaching requires planning and lesson plans and a lot of work put in, and you think that maybe after a few years she would just rely on past lesson plans. No, not my mother. Every single year she rewrote the lesson plans to make it better, to improve, to find new ways of things. I remember her playing the piano with new songs for all the holidays and different things. She never stopped innovating to give her children in school. And you heard the many things that Hannah read. The parents loved her, the kids loved her. And she mentioned this sleepover. So it was a reading sleepover that she invented. My mother wasn't going to settle for what was done in the past. New, innovative, that's what's going to be for her. And so it was a sleepover. And my father attended some 15 or 16 of them, where the kids would come back after school in their pajamas to spend the night and reading books while lying on the floor. Ultimately, I think they brought their pillows. However, I never went. Jen, did you go? No, I didn't attend, but they were a tradition and everyone loved it. It was all about reading. And speaking of reading, there was a wave of a new way. My daughters were part of that in schools called whole language. And it was a new way of addressing the reading and the learning, reading and writing. And my mother was taken with this, and she went to Australia. She was so interested in learning. In Australia, it was already being practiced, and so she took a trip and attended a seminar in Australia to learn the process of whole language. That wasn't enough. It was time to get her master's. So not only was she teaching all day long, came home to make sure we had our dinner, and of course we were doing the dishes and cleaning up, while she headed up to Trent State, which is now called the College of New Jersey, in Ewing, to attend classes. I can't remember how she did her homework and the papers, but she got her master's in the meantime. And it's unfathomable to believe that she could squeeze all this in. Now, was she always happy? There were times when she got a little aggravated, as you can imagine, with 5 kids fighting. And so there were some famous sayings going around the house. One was, when my mother got really frustrated, she would slam the kitchen cabinets. Boom! She'd say, better to slam cabinets than children. There's another one, kids can cry. And, I roomed with Larry, we fought a little, and David and Carl fought a little. And I don't know if Jen got into these fights, but there were some tears, and some rightful, and some just because they wanted to. My mother would say, if you're going to cry, I'll give you something to cry about. I don't know what that really meant. But we were coerced into behavior with a little bit of yardstick and wooden spoon guiding. My mother, one of my favorite memories of my mother, who always was trying to improve, and maybe some of it personally was through weight management, Weight Watchers. Well, she started working with a trainer, and David introduced her to David Egan. And she would drop, so she'd get up before school, 5 a.m., 4:30, I don't know how early, she went to Dave Egan as a personal trainer and started working out. And my mother actually started to run. She ran some races later in her life. And Gloria, my wife Gloria, and I went to Scottsdale to visit her, and my father, in their last home they lived in, and they belonged to a Jewish community center. And so we wanted to work out, so we went there. My father was not an exerciser. For him, paddling a little in the water was good enough. What exercise to him was the medicine that you hold your nose and you take a spoonful, something you had to do. My mother totally embraced it. I remember being in the gym. She was wearing the latest workout gear, the most popular sneakers that are out there, and those little fingerless but protective gloves for weightlifting. She was working with the dumbbells, working with the machines. She must have been there for an hour, and she was working with a trainer, not that day, but she was doing all the exercises perfectly and working out. It was quite a scene to see, and I was really impressed. That's pretty much my mom. I'll just say something about my mother and father in terms of being willing to learn new things, and I'll move on to my dad. Larry, our oldest sibling, came home from college having learned transcendental meditation and decided to share what he learned with us. And so here goes Stan and Phyllis and the children off to the TM Center to learn to meditate. And I remember some family meditations, and it must have been quite a scene. We had our eyes closed, so I couldn't see it, but in my imagination I could see it. So my father, who also grew up in the Inwood area and had not quite as good grades, went to George Washington High School, which actually is where Carl's wife and Elaine and Jessica's mother, Yvonne, went to school, because she also lived in the Washington Heights area. My dad was always looking at an issue or a problem and trying to fix it. There was always a solution. That's the way I see him. If you see something, don't accept it for as it is, try to make it better. Jen mentioned, some of the activities that we did that Dad was involved in. I think getting us all in the tops of fatigues, which were leftover fatigues from my Uncle Steve, Army fatigues, and buckets and paintbrushes and water in the buckets to paint the white fence may have been more of an activity to get us out of the house so Mom could get a break. But he was always doing things. His work, he wasn't really involved with us during the week. He was busy working, but on the weekends, between running bases in the backyard, massive ping pong tournaments. I remember once Larry and I were fighting, so he figured, well, I'll teach them how to wrestle. Wrestling is a sport. Maybe I can kind of calm this down a little bit with a sport. He's always trying to look at a problem and fix it. When he started to do more individual sales, and this is in a time before there were answering machines, he figured, I'd better make sure that if someone calls the house, which was the only number he had for doing his work, there were no 2 lines and business lines, he decided to bring home these plastic phones and teach us how to take a phone call. Hello, may I ask who's calling? We had to learn, and we had to practice on the phone, and then we had to get their name, spell it right on those message pads, which he still had in his apartment when we started cleaning out. He still had those things, as though his answering machine wasn't working, and write down the name and phone number so that if he didn't want to miss an opportunity for a sale. In the early days of his business, I actually helped him start the very beginning of what became reimbursement services, and then RSI. We had to figure out a sensible way to communicate what we were trying to sell and convince a business owner to do. And he came up with the idea of designing a graphic representation on graph paper of what each part of the insurance products looked like. And we just did some photocopying and brought it out to clients as an innovative way to understand it. Ultimately, then my father figured, let's help them submit their bills for reimbursement. And he designed, now he could have called it medical bills, but it was a medical receipts file. And he designed this to give the employees an idea of what a good bill would look like, because employees took out bills that were crumpled up and it was hard to help them get reimbursed. But he figured out, let's create a folder that they could put all their bills in and bring it to us to fix. He envisioned at reimbursement services a staff of people going out with blazers in there, with employee benefits counselor on them. That never happened. That never happened. But we did. Some of the things later on in his life, at the first continuing care facility was in Phoenix, was called Sagewood. he had a rash because the chlorinated water bothered his skin, and other residents had the same problem. No one spoke up, as those in the Evergreens know, not Stan. He, in a polite way, suggested and fought for a long time for them to use a saline, a saltwater solution, so that those who had skin issues could swim. Now, his attempt at swimming was quite a scene, but he was in the water. He was hoping that an expert would teach him how to swim. His body wasn't meant for swimming. When he came to the Evergreens, as was commented already, I don't remember who said, maybe Jen said, that he got involved. He recognized that it's hard to get to know people unless you had a name tag. I said name tags. And I get great joy seeing the name tags, because my father felt if only the Evergreens had name tags like it was at Sagewood, where he was before, it would be so much easier to meet people. And he lobbied and petitioned, whatever he did, and now name tags are worn, and that's a tribute to my father. And when I was helping Jen and Catherine and Barbara clean out the apartment and walk around and saw those name tags, it gave me great pride to see them in use. He also felt in the pool in Evergreens that there weren't enough, they were mostly women. Now, nothing against exercising women, but he wanted to get the men involved. I would have liked to see this, but he organized a volleyball game, a water volleyball game, which lasted one game because everyone was so sore they couldn't play another game. But he did. He wanted to get the men involved. I don't know if men ever came back to the pool, but that's what he would do. He saw something needed, he would go out of his way to make it happen. All the way up, I said, my father passed away last Friday, so the Tuesday before, I finally got an opportunity to come up and visit, and David and I were there, and my father wasn't done trying to make recommendations. In his state, he really wasn't that communicative at that point. He would get a word out, we weren't quite sure what he was trying to say. He was telling us, he said, get some paper, we need to write this down. And he was trying to explain notes that he, I think, meant to go to new residents who are considering coming to the Evergreens about things they should be concerned about or think about, and he was talking about sheeting, as bed sheeting, sheeting. We weren't quite sure, and David, I think, was pretending to write it down, I'm not sure, but we were laughing under our mask, and then he also went in the direction of toweling, that we should be aware of toweling, particularly Turkish towels. And I'm not sure what it was, but he never stopped trying to make things better, and I think that's as Jen said, there's a kind of a theme in the Friedman family that's always trying to look at an issue, never accept what it is, and try to make it better. And there's also something very important about Friedman. Well, I don't know if we learned from Dad, but today is an example of what he said, we're uncoachable. The directions were no service. He said, heck with that, we're having a service. But all the legacy of what Stan and Phyllis provided without telling us, but demonstrating, was what we gained, and I'm greatly appreciative of that. Thank you.
I want to just share one other thing from my uncle. So my mother has one younger brother, our Uncle Steve, and his wife Janice, and they live in Las Vegas, and he wasn't able to be here. It's hard for them to travel at this point. But he texted me just a couple sentences that he wanted me to share with everybody. And so here's what he said. He said, I have many fond memories of Phyllis and Stan, dating back as far as the time when I read that one should give paper for a first anniversary. So what better way was there to celebrate that special occasion than to give them a full carton with 60 rolls of toilet paper, which was delivered to their first apartment in New York City. Surely that would have lasted them a long time. Even though our families lived thousands of miles apart, my uncle had spent many years in Thailand, actually, in Bangkok. So even though our families lived thousands of miles apart, during much of our adult years, Our relationship with Phyllis and Stan remained close. We managed to visit back and forth after they moved to Chandler as we were living in Las Vegas, and we continued to stay in touch after they returned to New Jersey. We wish we could be there in person to share in remembering Phyllis and Stan, but thanks to modern technology, Janice, Leah, and I are with you virtually. We, along with all of you, love and miss them. So I want to finish with just a couple last thoughts about my parents and sort of piggybacking on some themes that Paul shared, that Jen shared, of what my parents taught us. I think about how families create traditions and legacies that they pass from generation to generation to generation. And I think in many respects, my parents started a legacy. That I think back to my father's upbringing. My father came from a broken home. His father gambled away their money, left home when father was little. My father and his brother worked since they were 8 or 9 or 10 years old to support the family. And so he didn't come from this, incredible, amazing family. My mother a little more stable, though I don't think anyone in her family had gone to college even. And so when my parents got together, they really began a tradition, a legacy of what it means to be a Friedman. And again, Jen and Paul both talked about some of what we are uncoachable. We're not very good at following rules. We kind of tend to do things our own way. But I want to share just a few of my thoughts about, so what did we learn? As Paul said, I don't remember my parents always saying certain things, other than I'll give you something to cry about. But they were not, you hear some people go, oh, my dad used to always say this, my mother used to always say that. I don't really remember a lot of that. It was more the example that my parents set, the things that we learned from my parents. So when I think of the things that we learned, I just made a list of a handful of things that we learned and that I think have become part of what it means to be a Friedman. So I think the first thing that when I think about growing up in our family was my parents showed us that we could be and do virtually anything in our lives. That Friedmans tend to see the world as like this blank slate where you could write your own book and be anything you want instead of being stuck within parameters that have been given to us. Paul might call that uncoachable, but it's the idea that, you know what, we can do whatever, we can create. I think that what goes with that is we all learn from our parents that we're also responsible for whatever happens in our lives. I mentioned my father coming from a broken family, really, and he didn't have the best of examples. And I never heard my father complain about that or speak with resentment about, oh, I didn't have these things. And my father both my parents had some really hard times. Never did I hear them, again, speak with resentment or disappointment or anything about that background. They had this attitude, all right, so if it's not how I want it, what am I going to do about it? Right down to, my father, and okay, if it's not easy to meet new people, I'll print up cards and I'll figure it out and we'll make it happen. And so we all learn from our parents that we can do anything and we're responsible for creating what we want. As you heard from my siblings, my parents were really high achievers. They didn't mess around. I mean, my father going back to law school in his retirement and graduating in 3 years and passing the bar exam on his first time. My mother waking up at 5 in the morning, as Paul said, to work with a personal trainer before going to school and then going to school afterwards to do her master's while taking care of 5 kids. My parents didn't mess around, and they taught us how to be high achievers. I know that, Yael, you and I have talked about a number of times that sometimes our children, their grandchildren, don't realize that that's not always how the rest of the world works. We just get used to it. That's what Friedmans do. So we've all been highly motivated to be the best we can be. My siblings talked about, as well, intellectual curiosity. My father just always wanted to learn. He wanted to know more about people. He would have dinner with somebody, and I'd say, so who'd you have dinner with last night, Dad? And he'd say, well, they have an interesting story. And he would say, they had an interesting story. And he would tell all about their grandkids and what they did and where they grew up and what, their son's nephew's cousin works in this field. How did you even learn all this? But he was just really curious. He asked a lot of questions. He wanted to know about things. And that's how he was. And I think we learned that. My parents are really dependable. And I think Friedman's learned to do what we say we're going to do. We're incredibly reliable. Honoring commitments is a big deal to us. And I think about my father and both my parents. And if my father said he was going to do something, boy, you can count on it. I mean, if he said he was going to send you something, absolutely, that was going to be done. There was no question about it. They were just very, very reliable, and I think we learned that. My father, in particular, also taught us to check our ego at the door. That from the earliest days in business, when I worked, I worked for a lot of years with my father, and I think about how I got out of college and I started the day after I graduated college with my father. And he treated my ideas as if they were as worthy as his. I was never I hear people talk about family businesses and, the father dominating things. I think, well, that wasn't my father. I mean, he was the first one to say, hey, let's go. And to, again, be excited about our successes and sharing with us and wanting us to be more successful than him. My parents were never people to, as you've heard, call attention to themselves. And let's just do what makes the most sense. A couple of people mentioned, I think Jen mentioned, it was Catherine that was talking about my father's, this both and that you were talking about, Catherine, in particular, my father's seriousness and his good humor. And we all learned to laugh a lot, sometimes to a fault. Our spouses sometimes get annoyed with us because we laugh often at serious things too. I remember, as a kid, started very young, we would have Passover at my grandfather's house, and he was kind of serious about this, and Carl and I would get sent into the other room because we'd be laughing so darn hard. And to this day, my kids laugh at me because if I try to light the Hanukkah candles, I get about 2 words in, and I'm cracking up, and I can't stop laughing, and a lot of people think it's kind of immature, but we laugh a lot, and I think we learned that from my parents. We just don't take things too seriously. And I think the last thing that we learned, and it was referred to, is when we laugh a lot, we also learn to carry a handkerchief, because Friedman's, we laugh a lot and we get this vein down our head that everybody laughs about, and then we get this stuff coming off the tip of our nose, and we just can't help it, and we just laugh so hard that we have to have this handkerchief. And I think about that last week when I was visiting my father, and again, he couldn't communicate much, and he was trying to tell me something, and I could see he had this drip coming down his nose, and sure, what did he do? He pulled out his handkerchief, and I said to him, Dad, you don't realize that most of the world doesn't do this except us, but we all just have this drip all the time, and so we can't help it, so we have to carry a handkerchief, because it happens all the time. In 1955, my parents started something that was really powerful. And I think that through the ways that they led their lives, they created this legacy that we've talked about today that's been passed down to 5 children and to 10 grandchildren, and hopefully that will be passed down to 10 great-grandchildren that we now have. And I think that those traditions of what it means to be a Friedman, the things we learned and what it's like to be a Friedman, that the best way we could honor my parents is for our children and grandchildren to pass that on to the next generations. Over the last week, a lot of people have asked me, how are you doing? Are you hanging in there? And I think the answer is mostly I'm doing pretty well, and I think we all are. Of course, we miss my father and we miss my mother, but at the same time, I said this a lot about my father, especially in his last couple of years. He had no regrets at all. That my father he lived a good life. My mother did as well. And, you make it to 90, that's pretty good. And my father often would say, I feel lucky. He often expressed how lucky he felt, that he had a great family. He raised families that were able to be successful and independent. And I know he was really proud of that. And I think he had no regrets at all. He led a great life. And so, you know, I think if I think about what would my parents want at this stage, what they would want, you know, Catherine talked about how my father had this tremendous interest in genealogy and the history, but at the same time, this tremendous interest in the next generations. What my parents would want more than anything is for the next generations to carry on the traditions of when my parents started. That's what he would want most. So I appreciate everybody being with us today. We're going to do two last things. One is, like my nose. Right? That wasn't actually one of them, but it had to happen. But we're going to say, there's a Jewish prayer, for those that are Jewish know, called the Mourner's Kaddish. Carl, actually, if you could share those with people. Do we have those? Which is a very common a prayer that we say in Judaism to mourn someone who's passed. And we're going to just say that as a family, and those can join with us. And then when we finish that, we'll be complete, and I want to invite anyone who is available to please come and join my family and I at my house for some fellowship and just sharing good laughs and some food. I live at 415 East Oak Avenue in Moorestown. These days, you can just plug that into GPS. It won't be hard to find. So 415 East Oak Avenue in Moorestown is where we'll be. And so, Carl, you want to lead us in that?
Sure.
We can stand and do that. Amen. Thank you again for joining us today. And again, we welcome people back to my house in Moorestown. Sure. One last comment from Sharon. Thank you, Sharon.
I know this is completely unprecedented, so thank you for your generosity. I might be one of those people that some of you might call religious, and I'm a Christian. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the Jewish faith because it's the beginning of where I come from. There are some things today that I believe that I hope I'm wrong, and that's okay. The Friedman family is so special to me. And David and Larry, I've worked with Paul a bit for a long, long time, and they remind me a lot of my dad. Very influential, very persuasive, kind of a bigger-than-life sort of person. And so my life will never be the same after meeting and knowing the Friedmans. I appreciate, Jennifer, your words about Team Friedman. If you're a Friedman, I love you. And I have amazing respect and admiration for you. And I know I could probably catch you at David's house and tell you that, but I decided to just, despite my nerves, just ask if I could say that in person. You have an amazing legacy. You are strong people. You are influential people. And you will always be special in my heart, whether I know you well or just I know that you're a Friedman or some extension of Phyllis's family as well. So thank you for allowing me to share today with you and to listen to the stories, some of the stories I've heard before. But I just want you to know how special you and your family are. So thank you. Thank you for letting me interrupt.
We can break all the rules. Friedman's don't have to follow the rules. Thank you, Sharon. Have a good afternoon, and again, welcome back to my house, 415 East Oak Avenue, if you'd like to join us.